Okay, I usually start differently, but in this case, this is still some kind of a sketch of a portrait. Bruno Taut, he published a book called Alpine Architecture, a very interesting book with what is called visionary architecture. And it is a book with visions, an exalted expressionism. And I want to underline this because I think it's important for students of architecture and also architects in general, not to let the dreamy side be forgotten. You know, Bruno Taut was an architect who built, but he was also a man who dreamt, and he had this ability to express his dreams in an, as I called it, in an exalted manner. And I do think that most of us in architecture do have this, you know, this disponibility towards what we might call, you know, in the absence of a different word, visions. And these visions would be said to die in a drawer, not to be externalized. So, but before we see the book, as I said, this is a rather hybrid material. But all in all, I think you will learn something about this German architect. This is a very famous pavilion he built in 1914, and it was destroyed actually a few months after it was built. It was built on the site plan of on the site of an important international exhibition in Köln, in Cologne, in Germany. But the First World War started, and then they demolished all the buildings, and there were some very important buildings there, not just Bruno Taut's, this you know, paradigmatic building, but also a building by Van der Velde and also by Gropius and other architects. This is the drawing of this, I would say, remarkable small building. And it's the kind of a building that if you build today, it will still be considered, you know, innovative. And again, this is the power of art and the power of architecture, that it transcends time. This was built in 1914, but we are now in 2021. But if you would build something like this today, you will be, to express myself in a non-academic way, the talk of the town. It will be published, I have no doubt, in Arch Daily and Design and other design boom and so on. It's a pavilion, but this pavilion has integrity, and has you know, almost a certain mysteriousness in its clarity, and that's mainly because of the top part, which is with glass. You know, it's called glass house. We have seen many glass houses, of course, but this was in 1914, and I think this is not just the typical glass house, you know, like the house, for example, in which Philip Johnson lived for so many years, and or some of the glass architecture, the glass architecture of Miss van der Rohe, and so many others, because this is a even the form of this you know, cupola is and its fragmentation into these curving, sinuous, you know, deformed squares is something personal and different from most glass architecture that we see. Plus, there is some kind of a connection with the past, somehow I feel, or maybe because I know it was made in 1914. It's an interesting building. It's an interesting building because it has, the base is circular, but the top implies the spiral. So you have both the circle and the spiral, and thus you have being and becoming, to speak in philosophical terms, and to be able to incorporate in the same building being and becoming is not easy at all. But he did it. And you see, this building is, I mean, it's perfect. Doesn't matter what you look at. You look at the elevation, you look at the plan, you look at the section, you look at the built work. It's perfect in its own way. It's perfect. We have nothing to reproach it. Now, of course, it was built for an exhibition, but it's a noble building, and it's very important. We should never forget it. This was built by Bruno Taut for the Werkbund exhibition in 1914 in Köln, in Germany. Alpine architecture. Now we arrive at, so what we saw previously is really, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, the most emblematic building by Bruno Taut. Now we will look at this book, Alpine Architecture from 1917. So 3 years after he built the glass pavilion, the glass house, he did this book. It's a book with, I don't know German, I cannot read the text, but these are, you will see some pages of this book. Indeed, it is an Alpine architecture. It is a dream. You know, you see the moon on the sky, you see some stars. It's literally a dream. But this kind of dream is important, I think. And I think we all have dreams. And I think we should put them down on paper or on some virtual medium, digital medium. So I will read a few things about this famous book, Alpine Architecture. Alpine architecture. This proposal may seem adventurous and even pretentious, but at the risk of being killed as immodest and utopian, it must be made at least once. It should merely clarify in a concrete form the tendency that encourage one to build high and should not be looked at as an end in itself, but rather as a suggestion that brings us closer to the realization of what was identified previously and to the fulfillment of further aims. The ultimate is always quiet and empty. The cathedral was the container of all the souls that prayed in this way, and it always remains empty and pure. It is dead in quotation marks. The ultimate task of architecture is to be quiet and absolutely turned away from all daily rituals for all time. This is what he wrote in 1919 in the Stadtkrone, but the city crown. In a way, what he says here is not too far removed from what Luis Barragan said, that the ultimate aim of architecture is to be quiet and silent and to comfort. Of course, there are voices against this, but it's kind of interesting that Bruno Taut, who was actually an expressionist architect, in other words, who valued expression, thought that the ultimate is always quiet and empty, and that in a way, the ultimate goal of architecture is to be quiet and empty. He said it, the ultimate task of architecture is to be quiet and absolutely turned away from all daily rituals for all time. This is certainly in contradiction with the prose of much of the architecture that we build, where we are obsessed with the functions and again functions, with Neufeld. Well, it seems Bruno Taut thought differently. And we look at other, exaltations by Bruno Taut, pages from this book, Alpine Architecture. The First World War from 1914 to 1918 had a strong effect on Bruno Taut and his later architecture because he became a pacifist. The ideas that he had created in the Crystal Pavilion, the glass house that we saw of 1914, would be framed in a deeper context, and they became, in the translation here is not so good, I'm sorry, I took this text from Wikipedia, and they became in the starting point of the architecture during the next years. Taut claimed that architecture had to find an alternative to the war ideology of that time, and it had to be connected with mysticism. As he used to say, without religion, there is no true culture, no art. This statement was framed within the concept Geist and Volk, spirit and people, where the Geist spirit was the vehicle through the personal aspirations of the man who were close to the creations of the God or of God. Now, this statement, without religion, there is no true culture, no art, is a radical statement, is a strong statement, but is almost identical, in fact, in spirit, is identical with that Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor, said, and with what an equally great artist of the 20th century, the great film director, the Swede, Ingmar Bergman said. They all said the same thing. Without religion, there is no true culture, no art. Bergman said that when religion and art became divorced, both died. And Auguste Rodin said the same thing. And I mentioned this before, that Ingmar Bergman thought that art today is giving the impression that God is alive through the works, the efforts, the individual efforts of countless little ants that transport the skin of the dead snake. And because of their individual efforts, the dead snake seems to be alive, but it is actually dead. Of course, a strong description, but I believe there is truth here. Bruno Taut knew what he was talking about, and so did Auguste Rodin, and so did Ingmar Bergman. This doesn't mean that we didn't have great artists, those individual ants that make the skin of the dead snake appear to be alive. So the very meaning of this book is connected to some kind of attempt to enliven, to give birth again to a relationship between art and God, between art and religion, between art and faith. There is influence here from the Orient, of course. This is not truly a European, there are influences here coming from the East. I guess he was searching for some kind of a redemption. You know, the First World War was deadly, and sensitive people like Bruno Taut responded to the damages done by war through creation, through creativity. Again, some kind of a crystallized vision of a crystal-like building on top of a hill. So in 1919, Bruno Taut published his book Manifesto, the City Crown, where from a rational approach, he established the basis of a new communal center, a secular space between the Gothic cathedral and the Asian temple. Didn't I just mention the influence coming from the East? In these temples, the latest aim of architecture, its function, is devotion to beauty and a place for the spirit. Bruno Taut attempts to a futurist utopia where technology has to help to the Geist to achieve the spirit. Shortly after publishing this book, Bruno Taut showed his new work, Alpine Architecture, where he designed his secular temples, in a very creative sequence of drawings. Glass and steel are seen in Alpine architecture or Alpine architecture as elements that break away from the materialism of the period. One of the main targets of Taut was to get over the limitations of materialism as part of his activism against rationalism. Glass was a synonym of the primitive purity and the paradigm of the innocence, an interior dream world that, instead of facing the ideological and social problems of the period, he enclosed in a crystal bubble. Well, someone wrote this. But it's important, I think, to retain his fight against the limitation of materialism as part of his activism against rationalism. And I think now, 100 years later, we are facing with the same problem, actually. Should we continue to serve rationalism and materialism with the same fervor, or should we oppose it? Taut seems to say we should oppose it. I mean, he even used the word mysticism. Well, how many of us think of mysticism today when we talk about architecture, when we build even? So yes, these drawings are sketches for possible secular temples, or maybe not so secular, some kind of structures that enhance a possible new connection between the human being and the beyond, or spirit, or God. They are, of course, they are visions. They are not, lucrative schemes. He was free to imagine. But you see how important it is to express your dreams, because now 100 years later, we talk about his book. This is the cover of this book, and actually I own this book. It's not in Bucharest, it's in Sibiu, but I have this book. It's a nice book, and unfortunately it became very, very expensive now. It costs hundreds of dollars, but when I purchased it, it was very inexpensive. I don't know, $10, $15. Now is a collector's item. I don't know why. It's very, very expensive. But you can find it on the web, and you can see all the pages, all the prints with his proposals, if we are to call them so, proposals. Proposals for temples, secular or otherwise, but temples. He was an interesting man, and he also had social concerns. And you will see apartment buildings he built in Berlin. So he was not just interested in escaping reality and flying high in the realm of dream. He was also very concerned with pressing issues of the time he lived in. So he had a duality, and that duality he served in significant ways. But you see this, what architect today would draw like this, or something like this, with a big sun. And it's clear that he arrived at that exaltation that Walter Gropius thought, that it differentiates the artist from the craftsman. Walter Gropius in the Bauhaus Manifesto said, both the artist and the craftsman are rooted in craft. But the only difference between the craftsperson and the artist is that the artist is an exalted craftsman. And here we see exactly this. We see exaltation. And we see some kind of, mystical vision, if we are to call it so. And also important, the influence of Asia, the influence of East. I launched some years ago a competition, a house for Bruno Taut, and I'll show you the best project that we received from a young woman architect in England, Hannah Durham from United Kingdom, and she designed a skyscraper, but is very much in the spirit of the Alpine architecture that we just saw. You see the Taut house. Even graphically, somehow it connects. This is her tower, what you see here. And, I love this project, and I would encourage any student and any architect to allow, again, the expression of the inner world and of dreams. And, it doesn't mean that you'll do just this, but it's important to not let your imagination not express what is capable of externalizing. So here is a portrait of Bruno Taut, and this is her tower, and we are going to see more drawings. I cannot read that text now, but all in all, it was a nice, it has a nice project. And look at this. She used the the cupola, the dome of his crystal pavilion or his glass house as part of the conception for the tower she built. But the tower she imagined is an original creation, as you can see. And look at each plan. You know, it was not a superficial little sketch. It was well thought out and rather complex work that she sent. And here she shows the process. You know, here it is some kind of a combination. This is the glass pavilion, the glass house of Bruno Taut. Then this is an approximation of the tower that Bruno Taut proposed for the Chicago Tribune in the very important competition in Chicago for the Chicago Tribune. And then she evolves slowly towards her round tower. Very nice work, and itself visionary and lyrical. Maybe too lyrical if you look at this image, but anyway, this is a text which we cannot read, but we come back to the glass house with other images, the important work by Bruno Taut. And you see, it's not just, I mean, as opposed to much of the glass work of today, here it is glass, but look at the complexity of each panel, if I am to call it so. There is a fragmentation here which becomes ornamental, and so is the floor ornamental. And so, you know, this is not just structure, it's also ornament, and they are just one together. A fine work, a very fine work by Bruno Taut, and I just don't understand these people. They built it and then it was destroyed after a few months, if you can believe it. But the calamity of war created many abhorrent and abnormal things and situations. And look at this, you know, who wouldn't love this? This is almost the peacock's tail, of which John Ruskin talked so eloquently when he said that the most beautiful things in nature are also the most useless. Okay, and now I'll show you the second presentation I have. But it is my belief that Bruno Taut deserves more. But all in all, it's an homage that we try to bring to him now on his day of birth, imperfect as it is. Okay, so he was born in 1880 on the 4th of April, and he died in 1938. So he died at 58. He could have lived longer. So Bruno Julius Florian Taut, born the 4th of May, was a renowned German architect, urban planner, and author. He was active during the Weimar period and is known for his theoretical works as well as his building designs. Many important architects, if not all of them, worked in both fields, practice and theory. Even Palladio, no, he published the 4 books on architecture. Maybe because architecture is a complex discipline, and you know the mental part plays an important role, but so do the practical matters. So an architect tries to negotiate between two ways of two modes of being, and one is the theoretical, the other one is the practical. So this was the man, and he does look like almost like a haunted man, an intense man. I like him. Here he says that he loves Japanese culture. Well, he's not the only one. Frank Lloyd Wright also loved Japanese culture, and there were other architects fascinated by Japanese culture, which maybe also was part of an attraction towards exoticism. Now here it is, it's a poem, Manifesto he wrote called Down with Seriousness, where he's fighting against pretentiousness, actually. So let me see if I can read. It's a little bit small. Hop, 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 my sweet little horsey, hop, hop, hop. Where do you want to go? Over the high wall? Well, really, I don't know. Hop, 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 my sweet little horsey, hop, hop, hop. Where do you want to go? This is a quotation from that writer. Away with the sourpussies, the wailing willies, the subursides, the brow furrowers, the eternally serious, the sweet sour ones, the forever important, 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 this damned habit of acting important, tombstone and cemetery facades in front of junk shops and old clothes stores, smash the shell time, lime, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, demolish the pin beds, uh, beds, beats, down with the respectability of sandstone and plate glass in fragments with rubbish of marble and precious wood to the garbage heap with all the junk. Oh, our concepts, space, home, style. Ugh, how these concepts stink. Destroy them, put an end to them, let nothing remain. Chase away the schools, let the professional wigs fly. We'll play catch with them. Blast, blast. Let the dusty, matted, gummed up world of concepts, ideologies, and systems feel our cold north wind. Death to the concept lie. Death to everything stuffy. Death to everything cult, title, dignity, or called title, dignity, authority. Down with everything serious. Down with all camels that one goes through the eye of a needle, with all worshippers of Mammoth and Moloch, the worshippers of forces must knuckle under the force. We are sick of the blood sucking, cuttered whirling in the early light. In the distance shines our tomorrow, hurrah, three times hurry, four, and I'm not sure I have the next page. Yeah, unfortunately, there are a few more words, but I almost feel like reading it again. And sorry for some moments of hesitations. I couldn't see very well. I have terrible eyeglasses, and the text was small. But I think it's important to see here a very passionate man who understands that actually the word concept is very problematic. And I know architects love this word, and I use it sometimes myself, although I'm not happy when I use it. And I will try to explain why. You know, he says, and you look at it, death to the concept lies. It's the concept, the word concept is too simplistic. It is the heart. The heart doesn't work with concepts. The brain does. But a good work is not just the product of the brain. This we must understand. So you'll never say the concept of my heart was this. The concept is born from the brain. And yes, it is important to use the brain, but it's not enough. And I think this is what he's trying to say. Besides the fact that he was sick and tired, so to speak, of the pretentiousness of historicist architecture of his time. In essence, he was advocating authenticity, truth. That's what he was advocating. Also, when he says down with everything serious, we are dealing actually with a man extremely serious. He was a very serious German architect, but he understood that play is an important part of creativity. You cannot create anything unless you are playful, kind of like the child. We need that playfulness in creativity, in architecture as well. And I remember what Friedrich Nietzsche said, that there are three transformations that human goes through. The first one is when a man becomes a camel, In other words, the camel receives a lot of weight on its back, is a martyr in a way, the camel, a slave, a perfect slave. And the camel can carry a lot. But at one moment, the camel says, enough is enough. I want freedom. So then the camel becomes a lion or a lioness, the king or the queen of the jungle. And now the lion and the lioness have freedom and they have power. But but even they are not happy. They went through the phase when at the beginning they were camels, then they became lions. They had freedom, they had power, but something was missing: creativity. And Nietzsche said the lion and the lioness had to become children or a child, because the child in his innocence is playful and creating and recreating the world. And I think this is what Bruno Taut is trying to say when he says, down with everything serious. In other words, regain your innocence, regain your or achieve that innocence of the child. Then you can be able to create. He was also like a revolutionary, like any architect or artist who love freedom and creativity, death to everything called title, dignity, authority. Yes, this sounds maybe too easy to claim the fall of the title of dignity and authority. But again, he wanted to tear off the facade, the mask, and arrive at truth. And I think this is a noble attempt. So he wrote also. I will read a quotation from this program for architecture, which he wrote in 1918. Art, that is one single thing when it exists. Today there is no art. The various disruptive tendencies can find their way back to a single unity only under the wings of a new architecture, so that every individual discipline will play its part in building. Then there will be no frontiers between the applied arts and sculpture or painting. Everything will be one thing: architecture. This is almost identical with what Walter Gropius wrote 1 year later in the Manifesto of the Bauhaus. The direct carrier of the spiritual forces, molder of the sensibilities of the general public, which today are slumbering and tomorrow will awake, is architecture. Only a complete revolution in the spiritual realm will create this architecture. But this revolution, this architecture will not come of themselves. Both must be willed. Today's architects must prepare the way for tomorrow's buildings. Their work on the future must receive public assistance to make it possible. Well, what he wrote 100 years later, earlier, is really, I would say, relevant for us as well today. Because I think this kind of attempt to bring back art to its origins. By the way, I searched for the etymology of the word art, and the oldest I found is in Sanskrit. It meant, I read in English, art equals bridge equals God. Well, bridge means to connect. And if you are able to connect, and if art equals bridge equals God, then there we have the clear indication that at the very beginning, art was a form of worshiping, and the connection between religion and art was organic, and without it, we have what we have today. But what can we do? We pay the price for our freedom. So here he has another provocation. The layman, the woman, and the child will lead the architect further than the inhibited specialist. Now, what do you make of this? But this is no different from what Frank Lloyd Wright said and what even Alvar Aalto said, not to speak about Le Corbusier. Alvar Aalto expressed his disbelief in the specialist. And Wright was even more acid when he said nothing wrong with architecture except the architects. Why do you think that Frank Lloyd Wright and Alvar Aalto and Le Corbusier was even more violent in his fight? In fact, Le Corbusier said, I love painters, I love engineers, but I don't love architects. So there we have three very important architects, and now Bruno Taut associated to them, saying all the same thing. The layman, the woman, and the child. Didn't I mention the child in Nietzsche's words? And the child will lead the architect further than the inhibited specialist. This also reminds me of what Picasso said, that it took him 4 years to learn to paint like Raphael and a lifetime to paint like a child. In essence, it's about the same thing, transforming the lion into a child to achieve the innocence of the child, that purity, that playfulness which make creativity possible. Um, so I'm not going to read what Gropius wrote, but he was part of this circle of intellectuals and artists and architects who were thinking of a new way forward after the deadly First World War. Here, another quotation from this text: "Are not we who are at the mercy of all devouring society, parasites in the fabric of a society that knows no architecture, wants no architecture, and therefore needs no architects? For we do not call it architecture to give a pleasant shape to 1,000 useful things: dwelling houses, offices, stations, markets, schools, water towers, gasometers, fire stations, factories, and the like. Our so-called utility in these matters, by means of which we earn our living, has nothing to do with our profession, any more than any modern building has anything in common with Angkor Wat, the Alhambra, or the Dresden Zwinger." So he was fighting with a prose of architecture. He was fighting with rationalism. He was fighting with mercantilism. And what he wrote, in essence, is similar to what Le Corbusier said. Le Corbusier said in a letter he wrote to young South African architects in around 1930s, he said, architecture is not a profession. Architecture is a state of mind. Well, unfortunately, most of the time, architects are forced to think that what they do is just a profession. But that's not what Corbusier said, and this is not what Bruno Taut thought. In our profession, we cannot be creators today. This is what he wrote in 1918 or 1918. But we are seekers and callers. We shall not cease seeking for that which later may crystallize out, and calling for companions who will go with us on the hard path. We know in deep humility that everything today is nothing but the very first light of dawn, and who prepare themselves in self-forgetful surrender for the rising of the new sun. We call upon all those who believe in the future. All strong longing for the future is architecture in the making. One day there will be a worldview, and then there will also be its sign, its crystal architecture. Then there will be no striving, no obsessive seeking for art in the life of various banalities. Then there will be one single art, and this art will shine into every nook and cranny. Until then, the utilitarian can be tolerable only if the architect bears within him a presentiment of this sun. It alone provides the measure of all things, strictly distinguishes the sacred from the secular, the great from the small, but it also lends to everything things a shimmer of its radiance. So it's a poetical, maybe mystical understanding of what the role of architecture is. How many of us today are able to think and feel and write in this way? Very few, because we lost the spirit of architecture. We lost being spiritual beings. we are just, mercantile beings trying to make a living, to earn a living, many times by betraying life itself. I'm afraid things didn't change from 100 years ago to today. Really, maybe they even got worse. So some pages again from the book that I just showed you, the glass pavilion, the glass house. That this is a contemporary modeling of it in colors. This is the proposal of Bruno Taut for the Chicago Tribune. He didn't win the competition, but this was his proposal. This is a housing complex built in Berlin, and you see the shape. So he had social concerns, very serious social concerns, and he built, social housing, quite a large building. Sorry, oh my God, I pressed. This was a presentation I made once for both Bruno Taut and what am I doing here? It's for Bruno Taut and Aldo Rossi. Okay, I arrive here and current slide. Sorry, I'm a little bit agitated because I'm still waiting for that package to arrive, and I am afraid that those books will get lost. Anyway, again, another picture of the glass house, the crystal pavilion that he built in Köln in 1914, which was destroyed. This is the plan of all this housing complex. He did all of them, and some, floor plans and the sections to one of these buildings. Now, they might not appear to be exceptional, although the symbolism, of this, bringing good luck to the inhabitants, and the fact that he was able to build it like this, it does say something that Berlin was open to experiments. He built this in the 1930s when Berlin invited the important architects to build for the first time. They did it again in the 50s and in the 80s. So they created 3 colonies of important building. I mean, the word important. You remember that Bruno Taut was vehemently shouting actually against using this word. This is a book he published about Japan, houses and people of Japan. Obviously, he loved Japan. And back to, sorry, as I said, this presentation is not one of my best, but it is a collection of images and thoughts. And I hope I'm able to evoke some of this, part of the essence of Bruno Taut. So these were built 90 years ago. And the houses have something of a dream themselves, a different kind of dream. They are almost, something folkish about them. You wonder, is this a modern architect? But then, we talked the other day about Aldo Rossi, and here we see windows like in the architecture of Aldo Rossi, and even some of the colors that Aldo Rossi used. Other pages from his graphic work or so-called visionary work. He indulged in all kinds of quests, and I still think there is a large invitation here to all of us to dream, to envision new cities, new villages, new institutions, new buildings, to give birth to the world again. And just use your imagination as much as possible. Don't think of this or that or Neufert or whatever. Think about what is in your heart, and try to negotiate between your heart and the brain, which wants to promote the celestial world concept further and further. Anyway, So this was the glass pavilion that we saw. You see at the Werkbund exhibition in Cologne from 1914. The phrase above, the elevation drawing says in German, the Gothic cathedral is the prelude to glass architecture. Taut's building was meant to be an experience of light afforded by a combination of glass and skeletal metal structure. Now back to the housing complex that we saw. This is a round house that he built, or I'm not sure if he built it, but he designed it, a round house, archetypal and primitive and childlike at the same time. By the way, the so-called primitive architecture in Africa, for example, has many beautiful cylinder, architecture, if I can call it so, round buildings. So when the rationalist says that it's prohibitive to make round buildings because it's more expensive than square buildings, I don't think it's true. After all, those villages in Africa are not affluent at all. They are very poor. Why would they build round buildings and not square ones? Okay, this is, I don't know what this is. Back to, sorry again, as I said, this is not my best presentation, but I still hope I can evoke something of his work. It's not shown in a proper order, but maybe it's interesting even like this, like collage of images of his work. Houses. He built lots of blocks of flats. Not very tall, but you see, he used color. This might have been repainted since then, but still, he used color a lot. You see, red and green on the same building. He didn't like white buildings. He liked color, and I think God liked color too. That's why the grass is green and the sky is blue, and the peacock's tail is surreally colored and shaped, just as the wings of the butterfly are. These houses have a certain naivete, but I like this naivete because it's really about some kind of well, maybe they are a little bit too sweet, but after all, why shouldn't we also have some sweetness in life? Back to the pavilion, glass pavilion, we saw pictures of this. The stair, which also has glass in it. We saw this, the cover of the book Alpine Architecture, and some more pages from this book, which you already saw some. Here is Bruno Taut as a younger man. Well, he died at 58, but here he is probably around 30 or so, 35. Another drawing, a contemporary drawing of the glass pavilion with the dimensions. The presence of the spider at the center is, I call it the spider. Again, it fascinates me, the fact that he was able to combine the circle with the spiral. And so you have, in a way, this is the Renaissance kind of part of the building, and then you have the Gothic part of the building, and even the Islamic part of the building. So it's a combination of various tendencies and aspirations in this building, although it's a small building, but it has a remarkable complexity and yet a clarity. It's both clear and complex, or mysterious. We should never forget this little pavilion that he built and which was destroyed. Very important. I don't think there are histories of modern architecture without mentioning this small pavilion by Bruno Taut. These are contemporary renderings. 1914, when the war in the First World War started, and that's why it was destroyed. And not just this building, but the others on the site of the Werkbund exhibition. Back to apartment buildings, which have a remarkable sense of freshness even for us today, I would say. You know, when you have a strong conception of conception is close to concept, but somehow it is more acceptable to me than concept. Conception of what the building is supposed to be, I think you can conquer the passage of time. Bruno Taut and the architecture of activism. This is another aspect of his architecture which I think is worth mentioning. Activism. How many architects today are activists? To fight for social reform, to fight for justice, to be less concerned with their well-being, but with the well-being of society and so on. He was an activist, and I think we need architects who are also activists. At one moment, I opened a website myself called Militant Architecture. I feel like opening it again. Anyway, contemporary rendering or modeling of the glass pavilion, which still fascinates people. We saw this from the Alpine Architecture, another drawing from Alpine Architecture, another page from the same book. And now I arrived. He didn't do this. I did this. I did this in a moment of crisis when I lived in Brooklyn, New York. It was called the Egg Building. I have a whole series with many around 20, 30 large drawings. These were like 1 meter by 1.5 meters, done in pastels. And I don't know if it was around Easter or not. I only show this one because I came across it and I said, well, just to give you an example that you can draw with pastel or with watercolors or oils, with whatever, if you feel there is something within you that needs to be externalized. And I have a few images. I was playing with ArchiCAD and I sort of showing this has no relation at all. Well, to an extent it does to Aldo Rossi. I am ending now this presentation, and I'm happy that the telephone didn't ring to interrupt, this introduction in the work of Bruno Taut. I will show you what I did truly playing in a not non-serious way. I was playing, so maybe saying in a non-serious way was not necessary. I was playing with ArchiCAD, and I am showing you this to the students who are here. If you are still here, I can teach you. The word is too pretentious. I can show you how to do similar things. You can do similar things in 15 minutes. I found a way to play and work with ArchiCAD, which for me is very rewarding. And I will show you one example. It's a sketch for a tower that I just did a few days ago. So, remembering what Bruno Taut said, that it's important to be childlike, to be not to be pretentious, but to have that purity, that innocence of the child, and yes, to be playful, down with seriousism. So this is the tower that I did in a few minutes. I so-called designed it. In fact, it was an unintentional architecture, but it's very possible for this tower to become a tower. I mean, a feasible tower, a tower that could function, and that it could be resolved structurally and functionally. And it's done very, very simply. I feel like laughing. So Any of you, if you are still here, a few of you want to know how I did this, not that it is a masterpiece. It's far from it. It's not a masterpiece. It's a little, I was playing. But if you would like to find out how I did this, I can show you in 10, 15 minutes. And you can do it yourself also in 10, 15 minutes. So it's very, very simple. This was this was how I worked with these prisms. I placed them. There is the aleatory movement. So I was not thinking. In this, I respected the advice of Wolf Prix when I asked him, what do you recommend students in architecture and architect students? I mean, students and architects, young or not so young. He said, don't think. That's exactly what I did here. But I used to do this years before Wolf Prix responded to my question, what advice do you have for architects and students? And this is an elevation. You know, I didn't put the windows, but they could be placed there. And another view of the of this so-called plan. You know, that's it. So now I'm not going to talk about Aldo Rossi. I talked about him yesterday. But here I see there are still a few people, and I appreciate